and good night, wherever you are. You could be from anywhere. So I'm Maria Lopietza de Luna, and my screen should be sharing. I'm from Atlantia, and this is Living with the Dead, an introduction to death in the Andes. So there are some preconceived notions that should be left at the door for this presentation. While some of these cultures have ancient origins, calling them ancient is kind of inappropriate. As you can see from the timeline, all three of these cultures fell during what we consider the early modern era of Europe. They're also not primitive, even though a lot of scholars and lay people tend to call them primitive. And I'll give a brief list of some of their accomplishments as we come to each culture. Suffice to say that while we can call them Stone Age from their weaponry and most of their tools, the implications of the term are entirely insufficient. These are some words that might help conceptualize how death in the Andes is viewed. These are modern Quechua words, but Quechua is the language of the Inca Empire. They spread it throughout their reign as they expanded their territory by a practice called mitmas, where they displaced large portions of the population to prevent rebellion and encouraged the use of the state language, which was Quechua. So while we can't say for sure that these exact words were used, we do know that the words and how they're used are well rooted in the indigenous culture of the Andes long before the Spanish arrived. Of a special note is how death for humans is a continuous process, whereas it's a final state for animals. For this class, we'll start in the far north with the Chachapoyas, who are still little understood in many ways, but left an incredible mortuary record. We'll head south to the Chimu II, who were the largest South American empire before the Inca. We'll continue south to the Inca, talk about how the Indian deathways affected their interactions with the Spanish, and finally, if we have time, we'll end with a modern Quechua folktale that shows a little of how these concepts are still present in the Andes today. After each section, I will ask for clarification questions, only clarification questions, because I've got a lot to get through, and at the end, I'll ask for more in-depth questions on the topic as a whole. So, the Chachapoya built Kelap, which is the dot on the map, around the year 600 AD and continuously occupied it in the surrounding mountains until the late 1500s. So they occupied the region for almost 1,000 years. Their accomplishments include raising the top of the mountain that is Kelap and establishing and maintaining 1,000-year trade routes between the Amazon and the Andean region, resisting the Inca, which is almost unheard of, and two-story architecture that's very, very uncommon in the region. The Chachapoyas were largely egalitarian, and this is indicated mostly by their architecture, but also by some of their mortuary practices. The Chachapoya have an incredibly long history that's little understood. A casual search will tell you that they sided with the Spanish, were unusually pale, and that some people think they were early European immigrants, which feels just a little bit racist. What we really know is restricted to the bones, buildings, and mummies they left behind. The Chachapoya practiced at least 3 types of burial. The first is the interment of bones in cliffside caves and tombs. Because the sites are remote and difficult to access, there are really no dates that can be given for when the practice began or when and if it ended. However, there are things we do know. We know that some of the bones were defleshed before they were deposited in the caves. We know that the caves are difficult to access both from above and below. We know that some of the bones are visibly outside of caves, like in this picture, and that some of the bones in the caves are sorted by type. Notice the leg bones together. And some of the skeletons are left intact. We have no idea why all 3 of these practices can be found in the same site or what it means for any of these different things to exist, let alone in the same place. We also know that all of the cliffside tombs show signs of human expansion, though the amount varies greatly. Some of the tombs just have expanded and stabilized entrances using stone bricks. Others are easily recognized stone facades involving a great deal of masonry work and sometimes painted, such as in this picture. While, again, the sites aren't dated, to the best of my knowledge, my theory is that the cave tombs developed and became more complicated and ornate over time. It also could have been a phase, like a stylistic popularity thing. There's disagreement in the scholarly community about how these sites were accessed. Some scholars are in favor of free climbing, while others believe in the use of temporary scaffolding. There's also a variety of beliefs about how often these tombs were visited, literally varying between often, all the time, and never after the scaffolding were removed. But it seems worth noting that there is no evidence of a scaffold, and that the archaeologists that believe the sites were visited often are Peruvian. Without a systematic study, we may never really know for sure. The second type of burial are cliff-side sarcophagi. There are hundreds of these sentinels throughout the Chachapoya region, overlooking the valleys and rivers. These statues seem creepy enough before you learn there's a body in every single one of them. The sarcophagi present evidence of the egalitarian nature of Chachapoya society, since they contain men, women, and children. Further study would be needed to know if this kind of interment was familial or not. My guess would be that these dead had a job to do, considering how they were all given eyes and miles of visibility. Though why or what they were watching for, I wouldn't presume to know. The final type of burial is mummification. The main site of mummified Chachapoya remains was near Lemebamba, Peru, and hundreds of mummies have been moved to the Lemebamba Museum, which you can find their website, but it's really kind of sad considering the amazing work they're doing. They don't really have any of the pictures. That's why they're sourced from somewhere else. Mummification was only practiced in the Chachapoya region after contact with the Inca, and was used much more extensively than by the Inca. My theory for this is the Chachapoya were actually in the Amazonian cloud forest, so they were in like low mountains, and there was no real potential for accidental mummification as there were in many of the other places people lived in the Andes. The Chachapoya mummified adults, such as in this picture, children, and even pets. And yes, he does very much look like he belongs in Nightmare Before Christmas. Mummies tend to be in the fetal position with their hands on their faces, and the museum archaeologists believe that this was likely for ease of transport. The mummies are being unwrapped and studied individually, and in a few years, we will likely know more about the late Chachapoya than we do now. Finally, we come to Quelap. Quelap is a source of a great deal of controversy. It's an incredibly old site that was continuously occupied for 1,000 years. It makes people think the Chachapoya were warriors and European descendants because of its citadel-like appearance. However, archaeologists who have worked on the site for years don't buy either theory. While at first glance, Quelap screams castle, upon closer inspection, the walls are to hold up the dirt, not prevent intruders, and rarely have access from the top that would allow the Chachapoya to attack invaders. In fact, Quelap is the only site of wholesale slaughter, men, women, and children, by the Inca that I've read about so far, which doesn't really scream impenetrable fortress.
Maria?
Yep.
Your mic is fading out. That sounds better.
I'm better now?
Yeah, it's weird. It kind of comes and goes. Well, most of it's been good. It started fading out, just so you know.
Okay. Sorry. In fact, Quelap is the only site of wholesale slaughter, men, women, and children, by the Inca I've read about so far, which doesn't really scream impenetrable fortress to me. One of the on-site archaeologists believes Quelap, rather than being a military center, was a religious center, and believes this was a site where the Chachapoya brought the bones and mummies of their dead for religious ceremonies. In the documentary I watched, he did not say why he believed this. Do I have any clarification questions on the Chachapoya? Lorenzo?
So far, no questions.
Cool. Now we're moving on to the Chimu. Chan Chan was the capital of the Timur Empire, which was the name of the empire of the Chimu. I'm going to use Chimu throughout the entire presentation, except for on this slide. They lasted from the year 900 to the late 1400s when they were conquered by the Inca. Some of their achievements include moving hectares of land to make the soil around Chan Chan arable. This region was previously a dune desert and receives about 1/10 of an inch of rainfall each year. An irrigation system that's still in use today, and an enormous city with 10 palaces. It was the absolute largest pre-Inca South American empire. Like the Chachapoya and the Inca, the Chimu practiced mummification. Since the Chimu populated one of the driest deserts in the world, mummification was discovered well before their culture was established in this region, since it can happen naturally in this area. This is a pretty typical Chimu mummy. They tended to also be in the fetal position. More interesting, though, was the reason the Chimu became an empire and how the power was passed between descendants. The Chimu were a highly hierarchical society with an elite ruling class, and their capital city, Chan Chan, had 10 active palaces when the Inca invaded. This seems completely over the top at first glance, but the reason is fascinating. The Chimu practiced split inheritance, wherein the heir to the kingdom got the power, but none of the land, attendants, or tributes of his predecessors because they were still using them. This meant the Chimu emperor had to expand his holdings and had to prove himself worthy by building his own palace because the mummified dead of his ancestors were still very much in occupancy of their own. This is a wooden maquette that's at, or was at, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I can't quite figure out if it's still there. And it depicts a mummy emperor and probably 2 of his wives, one of whom was not of Chimu descent, which you can tell by her ears. And they're being waited upon by their attendants. There's Chimu beer. It's really cool. I like it. I want to make one. And the palaces weren't by any means as small as the maquette implies. This is the courtyard of just one of them. The goods and mummies of the Chan Chan palaces were never studied on site because the Spanish raided them early on, and the mummies may have already been moved, which I'll explain during the section on the Inca. After the Inca conquered the Chimu, the city of Chan Chan was abandoned. The Chimu also have the dubious honor of having performed the absolute largest child sacrifice we know of anywhere in the world. With the Andean conception of death as a continuous state wherein the dead can help and contact the living, human sacrifice isn't necessarily terrible. The dead would have become something akin to an emissary or oracle for the people. However, this site is particularly unpleasant no matter how you believe death works. Originally, 137 children were found, but when the site was expanded, archaeologists found more. These children were between the ages of 5 and 14, buried in groups of 3 in age order, with their heads pointed out to sea. One researcher said whenever they put a shovel in the ground, they found another child. They were buried with more than 200 sacrificed young llamas, which were buried facing the mountains. John Verano, the co-head archaeologist on site with Gabriel Prieto, never expected to find child sacrifice on a Chimu site, let alone sacrifice of this magnitude. It's completely out of character. However, the site also includes a layer of mud, which may be why or part of why the slaughter happened. The Chimu region usually received around 1/10 of an inch of annual rainfall, but suffers from El Nino events every 25 to 50 years. The main theory is that the sacrifice was in response to a particularly bad El Nino event, which would have not only destroyed their crops, but their adobe cities as well. El Nino causes massive flooding. There is absolutely no doubt that these children were killed intentionally. Not only are there dozens of them, the children and the llamas were all killed by a cut to the sternum that shows no hesitation marks, and the rib cages show signs of being forced open, possibly to remove the heart. It should be noted that extensive sacrifices were incredibly unusual in this region, and I've yet to read of another sacrifice in the Andes that involved the removal of the heart, let alone in children. The children were sourced from all corners of the Chimu Empire, many showing signs of cranial deformation and other cultural practices that were not practiced in the Chan Chan region. While archaeologists believe El Nino is the sole explanation for this site, I think because of the timing, approximately the 1470s, the sacrifice site may be a little more complicated. The Inca had conquered lands all around the Chimu by this time, and the El Nino would have made them exceptionally vulnerable. But that's just my theory. In addition to the children and llamas, 3 adults were found on this site, killed by blunt force trauma and left with no grave goods. Verano and Prieto believe these adults may have performed the ritualistic slaughter and were dispatched with when it was finished. Was the event too traumatizing, or was it ineffective? Do I have any clarification questions on the Chimu?
No questions at this time.
Awesome. The Inca were the shortest lived society in this group, but the one we know the most about because of their extensive contact with the Spanish. It's really kind of interesting that both of the previous cultures actually lasted longer than the Roman Empire. So the Inca Empire was established around 1200 AD and was still expanding when the Spanish landed in the New World, spreading disease and violence and ultimately defeating them in 1533 and again by 1572. They did not rest quietly in Spanish rule for a long time. Their achievements include earthquake-proof stone walls that had no mortar, terraced mountainsides for farming, and mummification that made the dead look like they were sleeping. And it was the absolute largest empire in South America, and it spread much faster than the Chimu. I don't have any pictures of actual Inca mummies because they are all either destroyed or lost. The Inca people generally buried their dead above ground near their homes where the bodies could be easily accessed. The Inca region was speckled with mortuary monuments, some of which became huacas. All of these drawings are done by Guaman Poma de Ayala. He was of Quechua and Spanish descent. Huaca basically means holy site, and according to Padre Barnaby Cobo, they could be anything from a spring to a tree to a mountain. They were connected by lines or roads called cheques. While Cobo didn't know why any individual site was considered sacred, Guaman Poma de Ayala makes the reason less than subtle in his drawings, where each site clearly has a body, better or worse preserved, visible within the site to accept offerings. This seems to be a really good mummy. This one's a more remote, this actually looks Chachapoya almost. And this is another mummy in a cliffside cave. Lord. The Inca, and likely most cultures in this region, believed that the dead could influence their daily lives and deserved both respect and offerings in order to maintain their good intentions. This isn't to be mistaken for the dead being thought of as gods precisely. While all of the dead had influence over the living, the godlike stature was reserved for the Inca elite. The Inca are famous for their Festival of the Dead, where they paraded the mummies of their emperors throughout Cusco, but there was, of course, more to it than that. Like the Chimu, the Inca practiced split inheritance. It seems significant that the two largest empires both expanded in order to properly practice their death ways and give their elite mummies the proper respect. There's actually disagreement about where the Inca mummies were stored, the king mummies. They were originally supposed to have been stored in the Coricancha, and then there are differing accounts about each of them having their own palace. One of the theories is that they were stored in the Coricancha before the Spanish came and took all of the gold out of the Coricancha, and that they were moved to separate palaces for safety. But the Inca took the practice a step further as far as split inheritance and veneration of the dead goes. In addition to their own dead elite, they tended to collect or mummy nap the elite dead as well as the rulers of peoples they conquered. Formally, they were brought into the elite hierarchy of the Inca Empire, serving as direct rulers of their own people. Informally, they and their dead were hostages, which, combined with the Mi'kmaq, kept conquered populations under control. I think this is part of why the Inca had relatively poor control of the Chachapoya region, since they didn't have an elite class and didn't have separate burial practices based on class structure. Apart from the Mi'kmaq and the slaughter, there was little the Inca control the entire group.
Hey, Maria?
Yep.
Your microphone is cutting out again.
How far back do I need to go?
Not far, but it can almost not hear you at all right now.
Oh, man.
And then it's back again. It's so strange. It fades out and then
comes back. I made sure I was on the good internet.
It almost sounds like your hands over the microphone or something. I'm not saying that's what it is, but it comes in and out like that. So,
Okay.
you sound good right now.
Okay. The Inca took the practice of veneration of elite mummies a step further than the Chimu did. In addition to their own dead elite, they tended to collect or mummy nap the elite dead of their rulers, as well as the rulers of conquered peoples. Formally, they were brought into the elite hierarchy of the Inca Empire, serving as the direct rulers of their people. Informally, they and their dead were hostages, which combined with the Mi'kmaq kept conquered populations under control. I think this is part of why the Inca had relatively poor control of the Chachapoya, since they didn't have an elite class and didn't have separate burial practices based on class structure. Apart from the Mi'kmaq and the slaughter, there was little the Inca could do to control the entire group, who were egalitarian and probably closer to loosely associated family groups than a formal, highly structured society like the Inca were used to. It would be kind of a Greece versus Rome thing. This is also likely what happened with the Chimu mummies and was involved in the abandonment of Chan Chan. The mummies and the living leader were both gone, and the city no longer had a hierarchy or a purpose. The Inca also practiced human sacrifice almost exclusively of children, but unlike the Chimu site, the practice was rare, reserved, and out of sight of the majority of people. The most famous example of an Inca child sacrifice is Juanita, and she happens to also be fairly typical. She lives in the museum in Arequipa now. Sacrifices took place on mountaintops, which were significant in themselves and were also closer to the sun god Inti. The children were perfect, without blemish or scar, and tended to be sacrificed in singles or pairs. There's anecdotal evidence that the Inca people tended to cut their children so that they'd have scars so they wouldn't be chosen for this purpose. While being chosen as a sacrifice as an emissary for the dead, I think would have been a great honor. I think part of the reason they didn't want their children to be chosen is that their bodies would become completely inaccessible on the tops of mountains where they were left. There are more girl sacrifices than boys, but both exist. The children were brought to the mountaintop, drugged with chicha, and either hit in the head, strangled, or left buried alive in the stone encasements where the bodies were later discovered or dislodged by natural means. Juanita was actually dislodged by some sort of an avalanche and discovered by a mountaineer who wrote a very compelling book about it that is not based on fact at all. He made the whole thing up. It's very sad. Some of these children mummified naturally, like Juanita, by the freezing temperatures and dry environment. The sacrifices were infrequent, which indicates they were probably in response to great need. Juanita was almost perfectly preserved when she was found in 1994, but after a world tour and some preservation lessons, she is somewhat degraded. Apart from their ceremonial significance, the Inca dead were kept in the loop and consulted when making decisions, big and small, regarding their attendance and holdings. We're transitioning now into how the deathways affected the Spanish, because we know many of these events from the Spanish chronicles, and they were written down mainly because the Spanish found the practice completely baffling. The following account was written by Pedro Pizarro about arranging the marriage of an Inca noblewoman. Well, I expected to speak with a living Indian, but they took me before the bundle of one of the corpses, where it was placed in a litter in the manner that they were kept, with the Indian designated to speak for him on one side and the woman in question on the other, seated next to the mummy. Once we went before the corpse, the translator repeated the message, and while we remained somewhat suspenseful and silent, the Indian looked at the woman, which I assume was to understand her will. Well, having done as I said, the two answered together that her death lord declared that it should be so, that the woman should be taken to the captain as the Apo, which is referring to Francisco Pizarro, wished, where she would be married to a Spaniard. It is believed that the Inca mummies were also consulted about matters of state, particularly when they involved their personal holdings and tributaries. So even if you were the Inca and you were ruling this vast kingdom, supposedly all by yourself, you had to consult your dead ancestors through their attendants about anything you wanted to do with their tributes. The Spanish were consistently put off kilter by the ruler mummies of the Inca. Apart from patiently waiting through audiences with the dead, they also wanted their riches. Gold was used exclusively as a religious metal in this region, and it indicated class and the relationship with the sun Inti that the Inca nobility boasted. The Inca nobility were literally considered to be the children of the sun and moon, and that was how they got their right to rule. They were literal god kings to their people. Therefore, their bodies tended to be decked in gold and other precious objects. At one point, 2 Spanish soldiers were brought to an audience with an Inca mummy and his koya. Koya means queen, Inca means king. Technically, they were Tuantinsuyu, but we're moving on. Which they proceeded to loot, but only after removing their shoes as a sign of respect. As a side note, the Spanish were particularly appalled by how the Inca tended to steal the bodies of their dead from the churches where the Spanish thought they should be buried and return them to their proper resting place, which was closer to the home. Which is an interesting behavior the Spanish later replicated in this region by stealing the bodies of their dead from satellite cemeteries established during the Age of Burial Reform in the 1700s and returning them to the church. I just think it's awesome. After the conquest of Cusco in 1533, the Spanish probably thought their troubles were over, but the Inca kept rebelling. While their leaders were by and large conforming to Spanish customs and intermarrying with the Spanish, the common folk, were being organized by someone. Juan Pollo de Andegardo was one of the people tasked with finding the organizers and ending the resistance. What he found were mummies. De Andegardo claimed to have found all of the Inca mummies around 1559, stored them in the hospital in Lima, where they were either buried later, destroyed, or removed. In fact, the doubt about the eventual resting place of these mummies encourages many scholars to believe he never had them to begin with, or that he misidentified the mummies he acquired. Either way, the Inca rebellions finally came to an end around 1572, though there's been unrest in the region since. Do I have any questions about the Inca or the Spanish conquest and how the mummies affected it?
No questions so far. You're about, you've got a little over 25 minutes left.
I have a folktale.
Oh, someone did say misidentifying mummies seems to be a colonist sport.
Yeah. The mummies that were organizing the rebellions, as far as we know, were actually the Inca elite. And at some point, I had a book that had a list of all the mummies this guy claimed that he'd found, including Manco Capac. But there's a lot of doubt about whether or not he actually did find the founding mummy of the Inca Empire, because that was the first emperor. It's a big mess. And a lot of my sources are in Spanish, so I don't even know what they're saying, except for everybody thinks he's wrong. Okay. And to end, I have a modern Quechua folktale. I think I have to read it first. Yep. So this folktale is called The Asean De Ons Daughter. It was told by Miguel Wallman and recorded by Johnny Payne, who translated it from Quechua, which is excellent because I can't speak Quechua. There was a rich hacienda owner. He had an only daughter. One day, he told her all about his life, how he'd have to soon depart this world, how he'd have to die, how he'd have to leave his daughter alone, how she could make someone fall in love with her. He told all those things to his daughter. He told this daughter all she needed to know. That gentleman hacienda owner died, and his daughter remained alone, a good-looking girl, tender and sweet, plump and shapely. And as she found herself all alone, a young man, young like you, sought her hand. I want us to marry, me and you. Charmed, I accept. Cross your heart and hope to die. We'll get married, let's get married. But the young woman warned him, wherever I go, you have to go too. We go together. Whatever I eat, we'll eat together. That was their understanding. They began to walk down the road together, like fiancés. Out in the field, the moon was shining as if it were day, the moon shining like that. It was as bright as day. And the young lady had gotten all dressed up and put on some makeup, got out her purse like a damsel, a real lady. Her fiancé was walking by her side, and they reached the edge of town. They reached the corner of the village, the outskirts. They arrived at the cemetery. As soon as they got to the gate, the young man let out a holler and ran away. He left the young girl all alone. He didn't have any desire to meet up with her ever again. The boy got scared out of his wits and didn't say anything to anyone about what had happened. So another boy proposed to her. She accepted. What was inside the cemetery? You don't know? In a niche in there, she had prepared a roast lamb, spiced to perfection, juicy lamb. And whenever someone proposed to her, she had the meat prepared and put inside the niche. She had a little key, and that key was the key to the niche. Another fellow proposed to her in the very same way. When she opened the cemetery gate, he hollered and ran away as fast as he could. Now it's 4 down, 5 down. None of them could face her afterwards. The girl's still there, all by herself. So the caretaker's son got sweet on her. The boy would have been young, yes. I'm in love with you, honey. Charmed. Wherever I go, we'll go together. Whatever I eat, you eat. Then we'll get married in the morning. Oh yeah, the boy was overjoyed. He said to his mother, Mama, that young lady, she said she and I will get married. Oh, Mama, if I die, then I die, right? I don't know exactly where we're going, but we're going there tonight. He rubbed his skin with alcohol. He was going in high spirits. They arrived at the cemetery, him right by her side. The cemetery was at the edge of town. It was a moonlit night. She opened the cemetery gate with her key. Creak! It opened. He was at her side and didn't let go of her. That little tiny key was right in her purse. That little bitty key was the key to the niche, just small. And with that, she opened the little iron gate covering the funerary niche. After she opened it, she pulled out a big platter of roast lamb. That's what she took out. Crack! She gave the young man a big old chunk of it right into his hands. He took the whole thing right into his hands. The girl began to eat. The boy also ate his fill with gusto, because, well, it was good meat. Lamb. In the morning, they went back to the village. Right away, they married. The other fellows who had proposed to her almost went crazy. Why is she going with him and not me? They almost came to blows among themselves. There were a lot of suitors, but none of them suited her. No, she went with that man, that companion who had accompanied her. That's why they lost her. If any one of them had just stayed alongside her, had stayed right with her, she would have married that one. She married the least expected one, the caretaker's son. He did what he could. They came back from the cemetery together and serene, and for the marriage feast, they slaughtered sheep by the dozens. The other suitors got into a fist fight. I was her fiancé too. Me too. Me too. How did she slip out of my grasp? God damn it. They just about died. Nobody had any idea that it was roast lamb in that funeral niche. No matter who courted her, she accepted right off and ordered the lamb to be roasted right off too. She had juicy meat roasted and wrapped in a bundle. With as many sheep as she had, as rich as she was never at loss for a lamb. That's how you find out about a man's weakness. While the translator believes this folktale is about reclaiming land, and the speaker says it's about testing the mettle of a man, I read something a little different in addition to these two interpretations. I think the relationship with the dead is and remains a way to identify people who are Quechua, who are from the Andes, who are less European, less Hispanicized, and that the rich boys fled because they were more Spanish than Indigenous. While the poor husband expresses doubt to his mother, he doesn't hesitate and is unconcerned by his possible death. All that happens is a picnic with the girl's ancestors, specifically her father, a practice that has been established for centuries in the Andes. I think it's safe to say that if you travel in the Andean region, no matter where you are, you're walking on sacred ground. The dead are all around you, watching, waiting, and listening. And the Quechua people still respect that, even if they now have funeral practices that are more familiar to us. So be respectful, I guess. And it's still alive. And that is all I have for my presentation. I'm sorry it was too quick. I tend to read way too fast.